G'day mate, Luke Ford here. We're going to talk about the politics of moderation. I'm joined by political science professor Aurélien Craiutu, and he's written many books on the topic of moderation. And so he is faculty member at the Department of Political Science at Indiana University in Bloomington. And he got his PhD in 1999 from Princeton. His first monograph is Liberalism Under Siege, the Political Thought of the French Doctrinaires. His two most recent books are A Virtue for Courageous Minds, Moderation in French Political Thought, 1748 to 1830. And his 2018 book is Faces of Moderation, The Art of Balance in an Age of Extreme. So, Professor, how did you come to specialize in political moderation?
Thanks for your invitation. First, it's a pleasure to talk about a topic that is close to my intellectual and academic agenda. I'm an academic, I'm not a politician, so therefore it must be said from the outset that my interest in moderation is primarily an academic one. I'm fascinated by the topic for both professional and a personal reason. Personal reason is probably the explanation for why I chose to talk about it. I grew up under a communist regime in Romania. I've been in this country, in the United States, since 1993. So when I came here, I was rather an adult person. I was 27. And I had the great privilege, though it's perhaps an unusual privilege, to the importance of ideas in action. Ideas have consequences. Ideas matter. Good ideas oftentimes have consequences, but sometimes bad consequences, but certainly bad ideas always have bad consequences. The communist idea was a bad idea. I saw the consequences in actions. There was an impulse there, an impulse to say solidarity, equality, fraternity, went in the wrong direction. So living under a communist regime, I came up early on with an awareness of the importance of ideas, importance of moderation, self-restraint, compromise, checks and balances. All of these are part of, I would say, the conceptual field that would place the concept of moderation. So politics taught me a lesson early on, and that personal motivation that I've been pursuing as an academic in the United States in the last decade or so. When I my coursework as a graduate student, I asked myself very simple questions. What does it mean to get the regime of freedom on the ruins of an authoritarian regime? And a comparison came to mind that between post-1990s communism fell, post-1799 France, when the old regime ended. And I've been trying to pursue that comparison in my own work, and this is how I came to study the concept of moderation.
Okay, is the topic one that is also personally congenial to you because in part of your own life experience?
Absolutely. So there is a personal connection as yes. But I study it from an academic point of view, and that's why I wanted to begin by saying from the very outset, I'm not a politician. I follow, seen as an spectator, but certainly I do not practice the art of politics.
And what led you to your 2018 book, Faces of Moderation, The Art of Balance in an Age of Extremes?
At the core of my agenda as an academic is the critical thought through the lenses of this dichotomy between moderation and immoderation. I do think that at least modern political thought can be studied fruitfully. The lenses of dichotomies, distinction between moderate governments, as I said at the beginning. I think this is very important. I started by looking at France, 1748, 30, mentioned in the introduction, and I'm supposed to continue French political thought from 1900 And I wanted to write a book about the 20th century and the phases of moderation, mentioned. It originally was published in hardcover in 2016. Paperback came out in 2018. That book completes the 20th century part, so there's something to be written yet in 1900 in France, and probably I would want to prolong this American political thought in the 18th, 19th century. So there's a whole agenda that has with various aspects of moderation. This may sound immoderate because you don't know, there's the famous saying, everything in moderation except moderation, or everything, whatever, without demoderation. But the fact of the matter remains that this is a very complex concept, moderation. It's a concept that requires a disciplinary approach, almost an interdisciplinary team, economists, sociologists, philosophers, scientists. I think that we have here an agenda that will carry at least me forward for next year.
So what are the principal ideas in Faces of Moderation, the Art of Balance in an Age of Extremes?
Well, I started the book by quoting Barry Goldwater's famous words, occasion of his nation, acceptance speech at the Republican National Convention in San Francisco in 1964. Almost everyone remembers today what Goldwater said. I would remind you that extremism in the pursuit is no vice, and moderation in the justice, no virtue. I was always fascinated by this aphorism, Goldwater. I think he was wrong in this regard, and I thought that I should write about 20th century political thought to this aphorism. So my focus was on mostly books, thinkers. I looked at thinkers from France, England, and one from communist Poland, Aron in France, Isaiah Berlin, and Michael Oakeshott in England, Roberto Bobbio in Adam Michnik in Poland. And I drew some lessons for a 21st century. I wanted to show in the book, by looking at these phases of moderation, that moderation is much more than golden mean, as it is usually understood. It has particular benefits. Moderation doesn't mean defense of the status quo. Moderates are not necessarily to be found in the center, the middle ground between factions. On the contrary, I try to show in the book that moderates can be found on both the left and the right pile of the spectrum, as well as in the center. And I wanted to show that moderation is not to be conservatism as it is done today, but there are moderates on the left as on the right. That's important to keep in mind. I also wanted to create the moderation here, image of the trimmer. Trimmer is a person sailing, seeks to trim the sails in order to ship on an even. It's a nautical metaphor. That is the metaphor that I used to describe the trimmer. There's a second image I use, and that is used for the cover of the book, and that is the tightrope walker. That's the moderate for me. Moderation requires courage. It takes a lot of courage to go up the wire and walk on it against the power of the winds that blow from each side. So moderation requires vision, requires courage, moderation requires skill, a little bit of art. I explain in the book what that art consists of, and requires, if you a little bit of luck. Tightrope walker needs a little bit of luck to stay on the wire and complete his task. Self-moderation requires all of this. In chapters of the book, I sought to demonstrate a virtue not for ordinary minds, but it's, on the contrary, is notwithstanding a virtue for courageous minds, for those who have the courage, as it were.
Now, this book got a lot of glowing reviews. Was there any feedback that you found most interesting?
It's always good to have good reviews, and I was particularly gratified and honored to see, let's say, praise coming from David Brooks in the Times. That made for a good sale number of the books. But leaving that aside, things came to my mind as I was reading through the reception. The first thing is that moderation is one of those topics that doesn't cite all, but on the other hand, everyone that he or she is competent having something to say about this topic. It's the paradox here. Moderation is not a sexy topic, but on the other hand, everyone seems to believe that he or she has something to say about this topic. Number one, that's something to think about. Why is this the case? What are the consequences, and so forth. And there are many misconceptions about moderation, and the reviewers of the book, both the academic and the non-academic ones, brought for a very clear manner for me. There are many misconceptions about moderation. Most important of which, I think, the identification of moderation in the form of weakness. You have to be a weak person devoid of courage, devoid of vision, a wishy-washy, a flip-flopper, in order to be moderate. Now, the most interesting type of criticism, I think, has to do with applying moderation in 21st century American politics. Do we need moderation today? Some of the reviews of the book have asked this question, which is perfectly I don't seek to answer this question on the basis of moderation, but I will take it up in a forthcoming book on the same topic, moderation, that will appear as a form of letters to a imaginary young kid, not believe in moderation. I'm in the process of starting writing these forms of short letters to someone who does not believe in value or moderation. I'm trying to make a case for why we should take this virtue seriously. What is, when do we, when we don't need, because all of these are important topics.
Okay, so your faculty page notes that you are the director of undergraduate studies. What does that entail?
Well, that's a new position, and I'm not sure exactly whether I'm suited for it or not. I'm in charge of overseeing courses that we offer at the undergraduate level, basically. And this is a task that is by rotation. We are first and foremost teachers, so we have to care about the courses we offer. We are asked to care a lot about the enrollments. That's a task that the undergraduate studies has to making sure that the enrollments stay healthy. Because, as you probably know, we are witnessing a decline of enrollments in liberal arts education. Our students are mostly taught to go towards so-called lucrative or whatever, public policy, more vocational studies, and liberal arts sciences. Science is one of the liberal arts have suffered this.
Do you recall the day when you first thought about Donald Trump as a political actor?
It's tough to remember that. Certainly, the fact that my book appeared almost at the time when Trump was elected, might count in part for the public reception that it has received. I was writing this book during radical year 2014, so Trump had declared his intention to run, but certainly he was not high on my radar screen at the time. And I tried to stay away from thinking too much about the Americans while writing this book. I would not do the same thing while writing the one letters to a young radical, because I think that the question of Trump and what he represents we take it very seriously. There are many exceptions about our politics today. One is that Trump a one-man show. I tend to believe that he brought to light a series of trends that had been the body body politic for a long time, so we need to take him quite seriously, which is not easy given the nature of this personality.
I'm going to assume that virtually no political scientist predicted that he would win in 2016. Does that indicate anything important?
Yes, it does. I'm not sure nobody, virtually nobody is forecast. But there are indications of the fragmentation of society, which were taken seriously by political scientists. I'll give you one example, a controversial one, but nonetheless an important one. Charles Murray had been associated with the American Enterprise Institute, wrote an important book in 2012 called Coming Apart. It's a book that in a way announced Trump before Trump, 2012, probably was 2010, 2011. And in that book he described the consequences of fragmentation of the social fabric of our society. We live in echo chambers and bubbles. The bubble test is what made famous after the infamous bell curve. The bubble test is something that can be taken on the NPR website, on PBS website. It's a series of questions that show how thick or how thin the bubble one lives in. And Murray clearly identified a series of worrying trends at work in our society and demonstrated coming apart because we've isolated ourselves from echo chambers. And I think that these echo chambers, these bubbles in which we have retreated, it can help explain the rise of someone like Trump. It didn't come from nowhere, and the fact that political scientists have been living in echo chambers, I think, helps explain in turn why they were perhaps unable to foresee the rise of someone like Trump to the White House.
So I just finished reading a 1,000-page biography of Enoch Powell, and it notes in there that after he gave his famous speech on immigration, he essentially had the support of 80% plus of the British public, and yet there was never a chance that his ideas were going to be implemented into law. I don't know, do you have any thoughts about the situation where 80% plus of a polity supports a policy, but because the elites are 99-1 against it, it never has any chance of being enacted into law and policy?
Well, I am not an expert on this, but I will say one thing here which concerns me related to your question. I do think that we are witnessing a unique moment with our political systems. Up until now, they were, as you suggested, run by elites. The elites controlled the access of newcomers to power. Even the superdelegates in the Democratic Party National Convention, well, they were eliminated. And it's important that most of the political actors today were not in power 5 years ago, 10 years ago. Political parties, traditional ones, for example, in France, the Republican Party there and the Socialist Party have exploded. New parties have been able to gain power within a matter of years. Italy is another example where the traditional political scene has completely changed in the last 10 years. As a result, I think that the phenomenon that you describe is less and less likely to happen. Newcomers can challenge incumbents in primaries. You know that in our system in the United States quite easily, and it may be too late for politicians to move to the center or to those, say, less radical positions once they are nominated by their parties because a certain tone has set in. So I think that we're witnessing where the threshold and where the political systems are about to change. These changes are normal. Not too concerned about the changes, but we have to be concerned about the stability of our systems because politics, as any other activity, undertake as human beings requires some skill, but also requires experience and preparation. And I think that we see this with the rise of Donald Trump. However successful he may have been as a business leader, there are many doubts about that too, had zero experience as a political leader. And I think that not alone in this regard, but a certain level of experience, a certain level of expertise, I think remains essential to practicing the art of politics. So while I'm confident that change is good because old habits die hard and change needs new fresh air, I do think that we're at the point where we have too many newcomers in the political system. It requires a certain modicum of experience and tradition.
Do you have any additional thoughts on how elites change? I mean, you're an expert in French history. Surely there have been changes in who composes an elite. I just have no clue. How does that happen?
I'm not an expert on elite, but I would say one thing. In France, for example, for a long time, intellectuals play an important role in public debates. This was the case during the Cold War, debates between those who supported communism, opposed it, Jean-Paul Sartre on the one hand, Raymond Aron on the other, against communism, against Soviet Union. And intellectuals have been able to retain a certain air of, let's say, an aura of superiority until recently, but their prestige has slowly been eroding. And that elite is no longer what it used to be. Political elites, as I said, certainly change as well. So I do think that there is a kind of not only generational shift here. Intellectuals write books or publish in various outlets, so they need to be read. They will always be read, but a certain level of expertise will always be needed, even if intellectuals disappear. We don't talk about intellectuals in the United States. Academics have a limited role in public debates. There are some experts, there are pundits, of course, but intellectuals per se is an European term mostly. In America, academics like myself are rarely involved in public debates, and their voice is not taken seriously. So I don't know what to say about elites beyond this. I do think that age matters here. We are living at a point in time when the rhythm of change is extremely high. Rhythm is intense. Things that mattered 20 years ago, Clinton era, I remember because I was living here, are hardly of any interest or any importance to youngsters in your generation today. So that's amazing. Reagan era, that's history for many.
Does moderation in politics, is that usually accompanied by an enthusiasm gap as compared to more extreme movements?
Well, moderation is not necessarily a virtue that one would associate with enthusiasm. Most of the time, enthusiasm is suspicious to moderates because there's always a tendency to go to the extremes. Moderates are mostly of a skeptical cast of mind rather than enthusiasts. Skeptical that schemes for improvement, for example, always turn out for the better. And moderates know from reading history that human actions have unintended consequences, have terrible consequences. So there's a skeptical cast of mind that I would associate with moderation rather than enthusiasm. Enthusiasm tends to be seen as leading to forms of ism and, even worse, fanaticism. Those are the enthusiasts for liberty, the enthusiasts for equality, the enthusiasts for solidarity. Moderates require and request the right to, say, look at both sides of a question, and sometimes they require and request the right to be undecided. It's not a sign of weakness to say, look, I examined both sides of it, and I don't know exactly Well, the answer is they side with prudence as opposed to enthusiasm.
Would a large part of the positive reaction to your book be, particularly the paperback in 2018, because it came out in the Trump era when we are perhaps at an unprecedented time of fragmentation and rhetorical venom?
Yeah, I think so. I tend to believe that current ideological polarization is a factor that would make a book on moderation of interest to the wider public. Though again, this is an academic book and it cannot reach to wider public. I do think that polarization is a topic that interests all of us. How can we get out of our bubbles? How can we talk in particular with people who civil way, I should add. How can we talk in a civil way with people who disagree with us, who have different views, really believe that we are wrong, and at the same time are willing to engage in a dialogue. Propensity to dialogue is, I think, fundamental in any student of moderation. Moderates tend to prefer dialogue to monologues. Moderates tend to prefer compromises, reasonable ones, not the rotten compromises, to litmus tests for purity. So in a way, I think that our current political scene is one that has not only a high degree of polarization and ideologically intransigent, my way or the highway type, but also has increased number of litmus tests. I see people using this test to crowd with whom they socialize, whom they give credit, and so forth. For me, this is a worrying sign, and writing the books that I write, I seek, let's say, sound an alarm against this tendency. I'm worried that in order for us to stay together, we need to end to this practice. I don't know, of course, writing books does not help in this regard, but engaging in conversations with others, giving others an opportunity to reflect on this is something that as academics can do.
Now, who's the first modern thinker who's important in your area of specialty?
Well, moderation has a very distinguished ancient theology. It goes back to, for sure, it goes back to Aristotle. So we will mention that, but we won't go into details. But anyone interested in moderation should start with Aristotle. If not going further back to Plato and to see ancient Greek thought. But there's a huge reflection of moderation in Confucianism, ancient Chinese thought as well. Having said that, first modern thinker that I would say has something to teach us about moderation would be the French philosopher, writer, essayist, Michel de Montaigne. Montaigne was a figure, late 16th century figure who, in his essays, forward the very original theory of moderation. I have not written on Montaigne, so I would only limit myself to saying one thing about Montaigne. Montaigne understood that it's easy to be a radical than a moderate. Here to blueprint. A blueprint that one takes as a panacea and then holds on to it as if that was the final truth. Montaigne examined the pro and cons of many things. He was the first one to do it in a funny way. The essays, the genre, the essay genre allows him to play with words, but that moderation is difficult and radical is one. And I think, for that matter, he deserves one of the most important roles at the beginning of that. But the thing that really fascinated me and I studied in a virtue for courageous minds is Montesquieu. Montesquieu, the author of the Laws, 1748. What happens with Montesquieu is something Up until then, moderation meant predominant, though not exclusive, an ethical trait of character. Moderate tempers one's passions, avoid extreme, let's say, passion, extreme sarcasm. With Montesquieu, moderation receives an institutional and constitutional component. Moderation refers to Montesquieu's work, a form of government which he called moderate government. This was not present in Montaigne, but it is present in Montesquieu 2 centuries and 1 century and a half later. So Montesquieu is really a seminal figure with moderation, because there you moderation as a political regime and its checks and balances. It's not a coincidence that the founding fathers, those who wrote the Federalist Papers, Madison, Hamilton, Jay, and others, looked at Montesquieu as a national figure. And I think that's very important to remember. Montesquieu was defined as an oracle by Madison, Federalist, and referred to as because show them that moderation is constitutional and constitution. Known before Montesquieu, but not articulated as clear a fashion as.
So what hope is there for moderation in a multi-nation state, where you have many different nations within the same state, such as the United States today, where you've got Anglo-Americans, you've got African-Americans, you've got Japanese-Americans, you've got Mexican-Americans, people who in general feel very little in common with each other. What hope is there for moderation in such a multi-nation state?
Well, I think we need to look at the founding moments of the Republic to understand why moderation is the cement that together so many diverse elements. You mentioned nations. I would make a small, not correction, but no change there. I would say groups. We live in a free society. Free society is characterized by the existence of a plurality of Madison referred to factions, and those factions are and should be free to pursue their own interests, which are divergent from each other. Search for harmonious coexistence of this is almost as difficult a task as to find the quadrature circle. It doesn't exist. So the only remedy that remains to this is create a framework, factions, groups, ethnic groups, racial groups, and so forth, that can coexist together in a peaceful and civil way without killing each other. And this is what the founding fathers sought to do with the Constitution. Now, the Constitution was based on a series of compromises. Oh, no, there were compromises in the sense that parts had to give up something higher, desirable. But it was not a perfect compromise. Probably the like to remember this compromise that now the sun says countless person, slavery, person. An unacceptable compromise in our eyes today. It was a necessary one then to create something big. So the answer to your question is moderation is indispensable because it should compromise. In order to maintain free society, we compromise with each other. We need to give up something in order to get something higher in return. That something higher is something that we sometimes take for granted. The fact that we live in a powerful country, in a society that is an experiment, was an experiment from day one. I think this is something that we should always remember. Having said, it must also be pointed out, I think, that the fabric of our society is a very fragile one, based on compromise, based on what George Washington called liberal tempering, accommodation. I think this is the answer that I think I question. Moderation is essential society, precisely because in a free society there can be no enforced homogeneity, and this overlapping consensus in terms of his principles, rights, and so forth, based on compromises that have at their core, concept of.
So America is in an unprecedented situation in that it will soon become minority majority. So there will be no one dominant racial group in the country. I'm not aware of any historical parallels for this. I mean, are there any historical reasons to think that this may happen without widespread unrest?
Yeah, I see no reason to be skeptical about this. No, it's, as you said, unprecedented. So that's probably the best and the wisest answer I can give. So one more reason I would say to find overlapping consensus on a key game between groups that have more interest in common than divergent interests. Not a zero-sum game. It can be transformed into a win-win situation. Of course, remember, we are not a much more different situation than those 5 members at Philadelphia in 1787 were divergent then. The country seemed torn apart, was weak for one thing, Confederacy was weak. But there were many interests that were divergent. They were able to come up with some compromises, and they reached some consensus, but they didn't agree on everything, and were not to be expected. I'm optimistic about this, in the sense that this is always a difficult task, and just like human beings like to take up difficult tasks, they can also make big mistakes. So the future is open. There's no reason, I think, trying to answer one or the other. Depends on us to negotiate wisely or to make errors.
Is there an American nation as opposed to just an American state?
I don't know. I attended last week a week-long summer honors seminar on this topic, on American nationalism, and I do think that it's a topic that probably is as contested as anything else. What keeps us together is the way in which I like to rephrase the question. How can one be an American patriot? We do have the Constitution, sure, so a lot of ink has flown on this topic of constitutional patriotism. What keeps us together is not the feeling of belonging to a nation as much as being kept together by a commitment to the Constitution that embodies principles to which we all consent. We all believe in freedom, we all believe in civic equality today, right? And the right to pursue that path to happiness that best our intellectual personal proclivities. So that's, I think, in the DNA of the Americans. What does it mean to be an American is probably something along these lines, to be committed to defending those principles. But nationalism is a term that appeared late. It appeared in late 18th century, early 19th century in Europe. And there, nationalism meant, first and foremost, cultural oneness, same language, sharing the same culture, the same tradition. Not the case with America, which is an experiment on a much larger scale than any European country. So to speak of nationalism at the same time would be a mistake. American patriotism is something different. If you want to love one's country, committed to principles that make possible that republic. That republic is defined as an association of equal citizens living together under the empire of laws to which they have consented under justice. So I think I would say American nationalism is probably an imaginary term, almost all nations are imagined. Nothing wrong with that. It doesn't mean that some do not exist for real. But nations are imagined, techniques. But American patriotism is something real. People feel committed to this concept of American patriotism much more than ever.
Is diversity a strength in America? And if so, how is diversity a strength in America?
It's always been a strength. Again, the lenses of the Federalist stem, James Madison says, a free society means a diverse society. If left to itself, diversity can have its own excesses. But pluralism, which is the term that I prefer to diversity, pluralism is a fact of free life. Any free society must be based on acknowledging the plurality of groups, worldview, and so forth. So in that sense, that's the strength of any society. Experimentation, engine of progress, all these are linked because of pluralism. There's a lot of talk about diversity in our society, which is sometimes say along ideological lines, but a free society without diversity is
Can you have viable moderation in a time of war, a time of crisis, a time of exception?
That's a good question, and I would like to answer your question by looking at an example, a concrete one, which is probably the best answer one could give, rather than a mere theoretical one. Let's consider the example of Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln was a moderate. By all standards, Lincoln was opposed to extension of slavery into the Western territories, but he was not an abolitionist. He thought that there was almost no possibility for pursuing an abolition agenda and preserve the youth at the same time. So he had a larger goal in mind, preserving the youth. He was again opposed to extension of slavery. He didn't like slavery, but he was kind of unwilling to oppose the agenda of the strict abolitionists. At the same time, when the Civil War came, Lincoln was not shy at suspending the habeas corpus, so he suspended the rights for a limited period of time, but he did not become a dictator, not for an indefinite period of time. It's because he did that measure for the civil war, for the ongoing civil war. So he was in this regard a bold moderate. Had been a moderate before the war, but in times of emergency, exceptional crisis, he was certainly not a moderate. Sometimes it takes me to the paradox. In order to remain a moderate, one must be prepared to take extreme measures. So moderation doesn't mean, this example clearly shows Lincoln's example, doesn't mean middle of the ground solutions all the time. Lincoln went to the other, I may say so, in order to preserve the Union. But he didn't do it to preserve his own power. He wanted to save the Union, which he did.
Is the friend-enemy distinction the basis of the political, as Carl Schmitt alleges?
I think the distinction between a friend and enemy is the wrong way of thinking about politics. I think that if one conceptualizes politics to the basis of friend-foe distinction, I think one misses both the essence of politics, but also any chance for moderation. Carl Schmitt was not a moderate. Carl Schmitt ended up supporting cruel and inhuman regime, the Nazi regime. He was a great constitutional thinker, made a pact to the devil, and he paid for that. I'm amazed by reputation among both the left and the right, but probably it's because many people do not believe in liberal principles. Neither did Schmitt. Schmitt believed that parliamentary regime, which government and the opposition quarrel about the best ways of governing the country, are weak regimes. Are regimes based on a weak foundation, discussion, deliberation. He had only contempt for that because he believed that it's based on decisions making. And politics, I think the essence of politics is not the random flow, but I think it's based on finding mutual accommodations between them, entirely different life. And if you want to live in a free society, those distinctions are important because we will never be able to know what the good life should be.
I was reading the latest University of Chicago edition of The Concept of the Political, and it contains an introduction by Tracy Strong. And here's one sentence I found interesting. An intellectual consequence of the experience with Nazism was to effectively shrink, perhaps one might say homogenize, the language and terms of political debate in the subsequent period. So does ruling out large sections of what used to be debated politically and shrinking the realm of things that you're allowed to debate about, does that contribute to moderation, or does that perhaps set the grounds for a violent reaction?
I would say rather the second than the first. The book that I prefer to Schmidt's Understanding of Politics by a British academic, and his name was Bernard Crick. The book was published in 1962. It's called In Defense of Politics. There's also a wonderful essay by Polish activist and historian / philosopher Adam Michnik. It's called Grey is Beautiful. Politics is not about truth. Politics is not about friends and foes annihilating each other. Politics is about deciding in what's acceptable and what's detestable. Politics is not a litmus test. In politics, we have to deal with nuances of gray. Gray is not a sexy color like red, brown, or green. Gray has many hues, however, so it's important to make a judgment to distinguish between what is acceptable, what is detestable. There are many things that are detestable, regimes in which cruelty is exercised against citizens, regimes in which the dignity of individuals is neglected or completely eliminated. And we need to say no to those regimes. And I think that in politics, for perfection, seeking for purity, for the truth is the wrong way of proceeding. And I think that the distinction like friend and foe is wrong precisely because who knows who is your friend and who is your enemy tomorrow compared to today. Things can change, alliances can form. Politics is an open field, and that's the definition of politics given by Bernard Crick. It's wonderful book called In Defense of Politics. It's a mass activity. It's based on transactions, but not any transaction is acceptable. Not any compromise is legitimized or should be legitimized in the name of together. So this is where political judgment comes into play. I think that that's what distinguishes politicians from a bad politician. Political judgment. Political judgment requires many things. I have not written a book about that, but moderation is somewhat linked to the judgment. It's having the sense for what is appropriate to do at the right time, right circumstances, connection with certain constellation of factors that include other political actors, other people, and so forth. What is right to do at the right time? There are certain things that are right in general, morally, philosophically speaking, but should not be done because it's not the right time for them. But there is no algorithm that tells you when it is the right time. I would like to give an example about this because it's one of the things that concerns us today. The Obamacare, very contested piece of legislation. I think that a country like the United States should think about changing the way in which healthcare is debated and actually provided. But when it was passed, the healthcare bill in 2010 was passed without any bipartisan vote, and that creates problems that we are witnessing today. This is not to say that I am for or against Obamacare, and those who say against it today, nothing to replace it with. So that in itself is important. I'm just saying that the timing was wrong. It was a timing that set in motion all of the problems that followed. So the timing and the way in which certain things are done are very important for political action.
So how would you describe your own worldview? You sound like a classical liberal.
Well, I learned to appreciate the virtues of classical liberalism, but I would say that the phrase that describes best my political view practice. I respect people who align themselves to the left or the right, but I cannot do that. I think that we need to follow the fluid contours of life. And the image of the trimmer that I mentioned earlier describes best my position. This requires a lot of effort, I would say. Requires courage at times against the current. Not a matter of being wishy-washy. I would say there are certain firm convictions. I have a few convictions of my own. For example, communism was not a bad idea in practice, but good, both bad in theory and in practice, contrary to what some people might think. I do not think that anyone in politics can solve problems alone. So anyone who says I alone can solve it cannot have my vote. I do not think that in politics we need purity tests, litmus tests, my way or the highway. I think the spirit of compromise is the essence of politics. Those values describe what I believe in, and not surprisingly, the course that I study in some way reflect my intellectual and political proclivities. The thinker that I admire most, ask me, is a Frenchman, Aron, died in 1980. He was a remarkable example of intellectual integrity and political courage. He had the courage to stand against those who idolized the Soviet Union, but he was not necessarily shy at criticizing friends on the right, tended to ideologically. So in a way, to summarize what I've said in response to your question, I draw this thinking ideologically. I try to align myself with those who think politically rather than ideologically. Politically doesn't mean opportunistic, but preferring what is acceptable to what is detestable, not seeking perfection, not preferring modest step-by-step reforms to revolutionary breakthroughs.
I often hear the phrase intellectual integrity or intellectual honesty. What does it mean?
You have to ask someone else for a better answer. I don't know. I think that as academics, for a moment as an academic, I think that we learn the limits of our knowledge and the place we have in our world. We are not supposed to be self-righteous individuals, giving lessons ex cathedra, as it were, to others who are perhaps less read than ourselves, or something like this. We are citizens, and we share with others this quality as citizens, good partners in conversation. This is what I would define as intellectual integrity: the courage to recognize the limits of your knowledge and the openness in engage dialogue others on an equal footing, not thinking that they are or because they have different from yourself. it's easy to preach diversity. You asked me about diversity earlier. Many departments, many firms, many political parties, diversity. But when it comes to hiring, when it comes to putting your money where the mouth is, I mean, that's more difficult. People like to hire and to socialize with those who share their own views. It's very difficult to engage in conversations, respect those who disagree with us. That's a form of intellectual integrity. You are committed to this ideal, then you have to practice it. And for me, that's something very important. I know, as an academic, I know that many people in positions of leadership like to surround themselves by yes men and yes women. They are gender neutral. People who will say yes, right thing to do. I think Lincoln's example, again, is a good one. Lincoln's first cabinet was a team of people who disagreed with him, but he respected their intellectual integrity, intellectual prowess. I think this is a good example of intellectual integrity.
So my friends in the academy are on the right, and they're scared to death of being outed, or they're scared to death of saying the wrong thing, or they're scared to death of not being hired because they published in National Review. What would you say to people on the right who are scared of not being hired because they've published in National Review or the Weekly Standard, or are afraid to say what they mean because their colleagues will no longer speak to them? My friends in the academy have this notion that the academy seems to be, at least in the social sciences, like at least 9-to-1 left to right biased.
There's a lot of truth in that, and most of my friends are also, let's say, on the right in this regard. I published a lot with things such as Liberty Fund. I do a lot of work with the for Humane Studies, Intercollegiate Studies, or the Niskanen Center, now a centrist back in Washington, I should add. So I have a lot of sympathy for that, and I did a small academic program at Indiana called the Tocqueville program that has a conservative reputation on campus. We're accused of bringing mostly conservative speakers, so there's a lot of truth to what you are saying, and I experienced those difficulties on my own. Just because I wanted to promote, as we discussed earlier, full disclosure and in good faith, I wanted to promote diversity for that's very difficult. There is academia. But I would say that some of my friends on the right, as well as some of my friends on the left, have the tendency to tribal terms. My tribe above everything else. My party, instead of my country above my party. My country above my tribe. Sectarianism is not good on both the left and the right. There are many litmus tests applied on both the left and the right. There's a feeling of being under siege. And then when it comes to, again, hiring this, for example, people tend to hire fellows share their own views. Academia is particularly bad at this. And it's true that fostering diversity on campus seems to be a task of high order. But some universities are doing better than others. And I would say that I was encouraged, for example, that at Indiana University of Bloomington, our administrators were open to this and preserving this, let's say, climate of free debate. It's not easy to do it. But I would say everyone, your friends on the right, my friends on the right, as well as those on the left, don't think tribal sectarian terms. Your first wish, as John Stuart Mill put it in on Liberty, should be to have strong, intelligent opponents, open to argument, those who would be able to reveal the weaknesses of your own position. And that is my ideal. Seek to cultivate climate of dialogue, not with people who share the same, but with people who are intellectually honest and will be tell you when you are wrong that this is not the way to said and done.
So I grew up in Anglo in Australia and then in California where tribal was used as a pejorative. Then in adulthood I converted to Orthodox Judaism where tribal is the worldview. So why is the tribal outlook inferior to whatever its opposite is, which I assume is the cosmopolitan outlook?
I wouldn't put it in those dichotomical terms, tribalism, cosmopolitanism. I think that tribalism is a form of sectarianism, and it's against the spirit of pluralism. So I would put pluralism as the ideal, or the middle maybe between the two terms. Tribalism seeks to use purity as tests, and it's unwilling engage in compromise, dialogue. I don't feel comfortable seeing the world in black and white terms. Political tribes. So I'm speaking about politics, not in terms of or other perspectives. Politics, factions are dangerous. It's not a mere accident, I would say, that in the farewell address, our first president, George Washington, sounded a very warning signal against factions. I was reading the farewell address this morning in preparation for our interview. I was struck by the tone of Washington, 1796. He says we cannot live together, segregate. He used the word tribes, but factions. He didn't like the word parties much, warned against the spirit of party. And it is that spirit of party that worries me today. And it worries me in any tribe I see emerging on the horizon, because tribes tend to segregate, tend to isolate themselves. So factions, better term, though factions is a dangerous term as well. So I think that the lesson that we can learn from someone like George Washington's farewell address is precisely this one. We need to find those things that would allow us to live in equal and diverse forming groups with agendas, while also preventing us from killing each other, from maiming each other, from harming each
So
other.
I'm a sports fan. So a few years ago, I'd go to ESPN and I'd get all sorts of left-wing lectures on politics, which is not what I wanted from my from a sports website. So surely there are some political movements that seek to restrict the realm of the political, and then there are other political movements that want to make it total. Can you elucidate on that?
It's a question that interests me from the perspective of the book I'm writing. One of the dangers that I see today is politicize everything. Everything becomes political, and I think that the book that I mentioned earlier by Bernard Glick, Professor of Politics, while making a strong case for politics, certain form of politics that allows us to live together without harming each other, also makes a case for limiting the realm of the political. The political is not everywhere. There are spheres of life that are not political. There are spheres of friendship, there are local communities. The political is not the personal, as some want us to believe. There are certain islands in our lives where we do not have political relationship with others. And I resist this temptation. I encourage others to do so. Same, I resist the temptation of politicizing everything. There are certain things that should not be politicized, and I would say they should be outside of the political.
Yeah, like I've noticed in the workplace the last 4 years, like people are screaming at me and screaming at others to take a very strong political position, say after Charlottesville or something Trump related, and like friendships are being lost, and like people are, their veins are bulging and they're yelling, and you're either with us or against us. It's not really what I'm used to in California. There seems to have been a a bit of an increase in intensity of people wanting to split things up into friend-enemy distinctions in the private sphere based on politics in the last 4 years.
It's not only in California, it's everywhere, and I think that this only can contribute to an increase of the feeling of living in a bubble, because if you socialize only with those who have the same view or tend to share the same agendas, well, then isolating from society at large. If I need a plumber, I don't ask what's the political affiliation of the plumber before I call in. All I care is the person who job in due course, I pay him or her, and then the job is done. No discussion. There are certain things in the professional world that should be based on different criteria than the political ones. We shouldn't let politicals spill into areas of life that have little. That's why it's so important to cultivate, I would say, necessarily friendship and civil relations with people who dance. Again, it's easier than done, because there's a tendency to isolate and a tendency to see the world through black and white contrast, my way or the.
So what are some of the prerequisites for moderation? Are there certain geographical situations that make moderation easier? Are there certain religious or racial combinations or lack thereof that make moderation easier? I mean, for example, thinking about Schmitt, he was writing at a time when Germany was surrounded by a totalitarian communist Soviet Union, and was also surrounded by other potential and actual enemies in a very dicey, unstable, Weimar Republic. Schmitt's situation, I would think, would be different from other situations. So are there certain prerequisites that make moderation more easily attainable and more reasonable and more rational?
The example of Lincoln would point into a different direction, which is to say that sometimes in times of crisis, moderation, but a certain type of bold moderation, that is not a conciliatory one. It has to do with the psyche, with national character. The Swedes, for example, have a term for this. I think it's called lagom, L-A-G-O-M, and it designates a certain character, search for consensus and avoidance of extremes, and that is inscribed in the psyche, Swedish national character, certain search for balance. I wouldn't say that some nations are more inclined to moderation than others. Certainly I would not base it on climate, as Montesquieu sought to do in some respect, though for Montesquieu, warmer climates tend to engender despotic regimes, but I wouldn't certainly endorse such a deterministic view. I do think, however, that there are moments in history when moderates flourish, and there are certain moments in history when moderation has very little chance of succeeding. America was blessed with a generation of great politicians in times of crisis, so it's not like you have to have smooth tidings in order to have moderation. Without a critical number of mass of moderate politicians, we would not have had the Constitution in Philadelphia in 1787, which I take an achievement that we should not overlook too easily. So I think that it's also a matter of luck. When would we have a similar generation of politicians? One could ask, similar to the founding fathers. Certainly haven't had since. Lincoln is probably the only exception here. And it's unlikely that we'll have that many at the same time to save the country in times of crisis. But I would say that moderation starts with habits that have to be cultivated at an early stage. Starts with education. Starts with education of self-restraint. Being exposed to, I wouldn't say a cosmopolitan background, but being exposed to environment where people take ideas seriously and engage with them respectfully helps. Again, this is mostly an ideal scenario, but it can be cultivated in seminars, in reading groups, lots of things that used to be done in what we call broadly defined civil society, associations where people get together to things. So a strong civil society, I think, foster those habits of moderation, cooperation. My favorite thinker, Tocqueville, Frenchman, Lexington Books, was impressed by the vibrant society in America in the 19th century. And I think that civil society, just that the associations have become a little bit more and more factional. And I think that's important for that civil society that can actually strengthen over time. So that is needed for moderation. Because you can't be moderate practically experimenting, practicing. And what else can you practice in relations with others? You're not going to be moderate in relational virtue as well as one that based on self-restraint.
So, speaking of like civil virtue and good citizenship, Robert Putnam, the author of Bowling Alone, did some research on the effect of diversity on social trust. And he found, to his horror, that diversity destroyed social trust. And so those cities where you have the most volunteering and civic spirit and social trust are the cities that are lowest in diversity, and the cities that are highest in diversity have the lowest rates of civic virtue and social trust. Putnam was so horrified by what he found that he buried his research for more than 10 years until he could figure out a way to spin it. So that seems to be an indicator, if his studies are accurate, that there seems to be a bit of a strain between the pluralism that you endorse and civic virtue and social trust.
In a previous book called Making Democracy Work, which was published in 1993, reached a slightly different conclusion. He looked at Northern Italy. Social trust was high, so familial trust was high, and Northern Italy, different type of trust, but there were associations that provided other bridges between. And he tried to explain the difference between Northern Italy and Southern Italy. And there are different types of trust that comes into play here. The trust between families, one thing, but that is compatible with the mafia-like organizations in the southern part of it. And there's a different type of trust based on ship and voluntary that emerge in Northern Italy. There is a trust between not family members as much as people don't know each other that well. I think that explains why civil societies in a certain way in Northern Italy, and it was almost existent in that way in Southern Italy. Having said that, Bowling Alone, which probably he does, Putnam goes on to discuss the disappearance of traditional forms of association that used to bring together American cities, bowling, other kinds of sport activities that cities tune together in common. So today we bowl alone. That is not entirely true. Some people no longer bowl at all. But the fact remains that what used to be done in common is no longer done. The rise of technology should not be ignored in this regard. There are many things that we do today alone because of technology. And the social media plays a big role in here. We can no longer go back to the golden age of the 1950s, according to Putnam. But I think that trust can go both ways. I don't want to trust one thing rather than I want a different type of trust.
Ben Shapiro, a right-wing pundit, says facts don't care about your feelings, and then I've seen other political thinkers note that feelings don't care about your facts. I'm going to suggest that a person's psychological state will probably predispose them to a certain type of politics.
Yeah, probably. I don't know what to say. I think one's experience is important here. What do you study? What kind of family background you come from? All this have implications. Factors have implications for cultivating habits of the heart and mind, to use them favored by Tocqueville. Those habits of the heart make us more likely to certain life than others, and properly cultivated, they can engender marvels in democratic regimes. The importance of civic culture was one of the lessons that Plon, about whom we spoke earlier, learned from Tocqueville. A democratic society is based on a certain type of civic culture. You have apathetic free riders in society, first type of care very little about others. Those bridges between individuals will be eroded. They will not be there. So I think we can no longer have the same type of culture like in the 1950s, 1960s America. And we shouldn't try to go back. We should try to imagine type of civic culture for the 21st century. Unfortunately, what we see today is so far is a fragmentation of political culture, tribes, as I said, into factions, and a high level of ideological polarization and intransigence. Again, I cannot do much to change this, but my own work as an academic, a spectator, can point to other ways of thinking about this, and perhaps highlight some contemporary individuals who might provide some sources of inspiration. But each of us has a very limited experience, and we are part of a larger social experiment that no one can foresee and seize direction or control societies. We are bound to many good things and perhaps many bad things. So what else can we say?
Why do you think there's been such an explosion of interest in Carl Schmitt over the past 30 years?
I've never been a great fan of Carl Schmitt, so I haven't followed much of it, but I've written one article about him. I think Carl Schmitt and understanding of politics between friend and foe has something to do with it. Yes, he's known for that. There's a fascination with big things. Carl Schmitt was not a liberal thinker in the sense that we understand. By the way, liberalism taken in the European world, which is a doctrine by himself. So he hated that. He believed that based on deliberation, discussions are viable. And I think that it's a kind of attraction to the extremes on both sides of the political spectrum. I respect him as a constitutional thinker, more so than a political. So it's a book on constitution, published in 1928, most important work, not the concept of the political. But I'm surprised to see how much, for example, Schmitt is read today as opposed to Max Weber, his contemporary. Weber was by far among the two, covered so many areas of scholarship that could put them all here. But yet he doesn't have the same appeal as Schmitt. Weber died 1919, so it was probably a little bit earlier than he could have lived longer, and he could have had more impact on the youth in Germany, but Schmitt had that role.
I live in Los Angeles, where almost nobody cares about local politics. So what does widespread apathy about politics, how does that relate to creating political moderation?
Well, I don't know how to answer these questions in general because it's LA and not the town where I live, but I will try to answer it in the lenses of one of my colleagues. The late Elinor Ostrom was a colleague of mine at Indiana University and won the Nobel Prize for Economics in 2009, so 10 years ago. Interested in how people come together to solve common source problems. We have many issues, many sources that we share in common, and those sometimes are dealt with by mechanisms of the market or by the state. And she looked at how people solve problems such as how are police services rendered large metropolitan cities. She came from LA. She studied police LA, St. Louis, Chicago, Indianapolis, and others. And the best ways to solve these problems is by involvement. You don't have to let the market or the state dictate what it works. You try things and you bring your representatives, or through personal involvement, you solve those issues. Not anything can be done at the local level. Some things can be done at the state level or the federal level, and it's the political system. Certain things are involvement. Education is probably the example in this regard. You can't expect our educational system to run from Washington or from the state capital, from Sacramento or from Indianapolis, where I live. It has to be done at the local level. The involvement takes time. We all live big lives. We don't have time to turn ourselves. Our society is a modern one based on labor. Result, most of us tend to rely on experts, others doing work differently. That's a pity. There's a price to pay for that as well.
Right. America gets criticized for having a low rate of political turnout, but it might also indicate that most people are fairly satisfied with the way things are, and it may actually be a sign of political health to have low voter turnout.
I don't know. I don't think so. I think that if we are responsible citizens, it's not only voting that matters, the level of information, it's other things for your community that people do. So those who stay involved with their tend to also vote. Voting is a different issue insofar as our votes sometimes don't count. It's not very reasonable, some people say, to vote because the impact of the vote is limited. So I wouldn't put too much emphasis on voting. But I do see a correlation between being an involved citizen, and being involved in the voting process. I think that it's very important for citizens to be engaged in conversation and being in contact with their representatives. If you don't know who your representative is, never engage with the representative in a certain way with regard to certain topics, then I think that you are an apathetic citizen. I tend to be in touch with our representatives and I follow what they do because their work matters, all of us. And I think that that's one example in which people can be responsible citizens. But if you don't know who your representative is, if you don't inform yourself, it's unlikely you can be a responsible citizen.
There's a relatively new field called biopolitics. It's looking at biology in political behavior. I would have to think that biology plays a big role in political moderation, as it seems to play a big role in everything else. Is this something that you've thought about?
No, not at all. And actually, I'm rather skeptical of itself because I do think that we are free. No determinism that limits on what we can. Of course, we have our limit temporal horizons. But beyond that, I think that we are not conditioned by race, by ourselves or other things. I like to live with my favorite thing, that we are free to make many good things, bad things.
So is that a statement of faith akin to the Christian saying that I believe Jesus is the Christ?
Not necessarily. It's a statement of, I would say, a political faith in the freedom of individuals. I think that really determinism has an experience more in our political lives.
Would you find it dispiriting to find out that the limits that each individual person has are biologically constrained, or would you accept that as a truth if you receive sufficient evidence?
I don't know how to answer this question. I'm well aware of the knowledge. I think all moderates, political moderates that I've studied, or I think good exemplars of intellectual humor. So yes, it's important to acknowledge that a little part of it, not the whole truth, and that much more remains known and to discover.
Is there dangerous knowledge? Like, are there facts that we shouldn't know?
Not necessarily. Not necessarily. I'm firmly convinced, for example, that there's a lot of danger in the things that we already know, and some make good use of that knowledge, and some make bad use of that knowledge.
So, what will be your next book, and when will it come out, approximately?
Well, the book that I mentioned, Letters to a Young Radical, Moderate, will most likely be finished by the end of next year, and hopefully put out by Cambridge University Press. They signed a contract in 2021.
Okay, and which of your previous books, aside from Faces of Moderation, can you talk to me about some of your other books and tell me a little bit about them?
Well, as I mentioned, I'm a fan of Tocqueville, and in 2009 I published a colleague from England, a collection of his writings on America after 1840. So that's a book I'm mostly proud of. We both worked in the archives, and we translated and found new documents. Tocqueville wrote Democracy in America, the book most known. 1835, he published it in 1840, 2 volumes in France, and then he lived 19 more years. He died in 1889 in southern France. So we asked a very simple question, strangely, had not been asked before. What happened on America between 1840, when he published the second and the last published volume of Democracy in America, and his death? And so looked at all of the mentions of America and his correspondence with American friends, those in which America was a subject of conversation. And we published this volume entitled Tocqueville on America after 1840, Letters and Other Writings, which came out with Cambridge University Press 10 years ago in 2009. That's a book I'm very proud of, because it involved archival research, something that don't normally do. It's difficult, and it's extremely rewarding, because the book contains about 200 pages of previously unpublished.
Okay, is there anything that I should have asked you and I didn't ask you, or anything you'd like to add?
I think we've had a wonderful array of questions that I think covered a lot of territory, so I'm fine.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Professor. I appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Take care.